I'm Jess, and in today's session we are talking about the Bible. Now, the Bible is my favourite book in the whole world, and I am not the only one. Did you know that the Bible is the most sold book in human history? It just eclipses all the other books, and that's because there is so much that is great about it. In today's session we're going to talk about some of the features of the Bible, how it is that you can start reading it, and why it is so good. My favourite part about the Bible, the thing that I think is the best about it, is that it shows how God has always been involved in human history since the beginning of the world. In fact, it even tells us how God made the world and humans. So he started human history in that regard. The Bible has lots of different genres. Now, this is a word you may have heard your English teacher talk about in school. Genres are different kinds of literature. So the Bible, it has stories, it has poetry, it has these wise sayings, we call them proverbs, it's got songs, it has lists of laws, it has genealogies so you can find out who everyone was related to. It's also got this very specific kind of writing called apocalyptic literature, which is kind of fun. It has letters, so you can literally read other people's mail if you want to. But the most common type of writing in the Bible is narrative. The Bible is full of different stories about men and women and nations and all the good and bad things that they did. More than that though, the Bible is actually the story about God. He is the main character. And as the main character, every event in the Bible tells us something about who God is. So when we read about people doing silly things and God saving them, that's not just a story about people doing silly things, but that's a story about God's forgiveness and grace. And that tells us that God is forgiving and gracious. When we read about people doing wrong things or evil things and they suffer the consequences, we're reminded that our God is holy and he has a standard. The Bible is made up of 66 books. These aren't books like we know books, but they also are chapters, which is kind of a little bit what they look like. Rather, each book is a contained unit and it has a particular message and was written for an audience at a specific time. Now, some of these books are quite small and others are pretty long, and they're divided over two parts, which we call the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is the first part of the Bible and it's the biggest. It's got 39 books. The New Testament is the second part, and that has 27 books. The Old Testament tells us the story of the nation of Israel, who are God's chosen people to bless the earth. It includes the stories of how the world began, how Adam and Eve sinned and everything just went so crazy. It also has other stories you might be aware of, like Noah's Ark or David and Goliath. The Old Testament can be hard to understand and hard to read because it's talking about people and things that happened thousands of years ago. But it's also talking about rules and customs that just aren't relevant to us. Like, we don't live our life the same way they did in the Old Testament. And sometimes it uses imagery and symbolism that just doesn't make sense to us because we weren't around at that time. As part of the Bible, the stories in the Old Testament, though, are about God's activity in the world. And it's looking forward to what God is going to do. As you read it, you can kind of see that everything is not right. It's not how it's supposed to be. And in any story that we approach, whenever you're watching a movie or reading a book, you're always looking for the happy ending. You're always wondering, how is it that everything is going to end up fixed and better? Well, spoiler alert, God actually tells us at the beginning of the Bible that he's going to come and fix the problem. So as we read through the Old Testament and we can see all the things that are wrong with the world, we're also looking forward to the solution that God is going to bring as the hero of our story. This brings us then to the New Testament. So the New Testament begins with 4 books which we call Gospels. And they all tell us about how Jesus and how he lived his life on earth. They talk about how he was born, how he lived, his miracles, and then, importantly, his death and resurrection. They're written by 4 different people, and even though some of the events they record are very similar, they're all different. It's kind of like if those same 4 people went on a holiday and they all came back and told you about it. The events would be similar, but they'd all have a different take on the holiday. Why do we have 4 books on Jesus? Because he's a big deal. He's literally the big moment in the Bible where God becomes a human and sets about changing all the things that have been wrong. This is the moment that you spend all the whole Old Testament looking for when God comes to fix the problem. Jesus is the reason the Old Testament is the Old Testament, because he does something new. And now because of what he's done, we are made new and we can see his good work impact every area of our world. The rest of the New Testament, after the stories of Jesus and his followers, which are written in the book of Acts, it's devoted to helping us live in light of this magnificent new life that Christ has given us. For that reason, it's so important that we read the Bible regularly. And when I say regularly, I mean every day. In 2 Timothy 3, verse 16 to 17, which by the way is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy, it says, "All scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work." Who is the servant of God? That would be you. And you have a God-given purpose and work to do. So you need to be reading the Bible regularly so you have everything you need to be able to do that work well. So where do you start? Well, normally with books, we start at the beginning and we read to the end. And well, you could do that if you wanted to, but I would recommend you start with Jesus first. So the Gospels. There's 4 you can pick from, but I would start with Luke. And then you can read his sequel, which is the book of Acts. And that tells the story of how the good news about Jesus started to spread around the world. After that, you might like to read one of the other Gospels, or maybe you could ask a good Christian friend what they suggest. If you want to see what the Old Testament is about, Genesis, the very first book, is a great read. Look, there are so many options, and the best bit is the more you read it, the more you get to know about God and how good he is, how much he loves us, and how invested he has been in human history since it first began. And that is really what makes the Bible the best book ever.